We like to imagine writers as vessels of sudden divine inspiration, struck by a muse and frantically filling pages in a fever dream of creativity. The reality is usually much quieter and a lot more agonizing. It looks like this: staring at a blank page, waiting for a miracle that isn't coming. If you ask the people who do this for a living, you'll rarely hear them describe the process as joyful. The confessions printed in the Writers on Writing column in the New York Times reveal a shared psychological friction, an endless fight against the inadequacy of language itself. Take Elie Wiesel. He described language as a perpetual obstacle. Every page he wrote was met with the thought that his words were weak and pale, failing to capture the true purity of the ideas they were meant to represent. Or Walter Mosley, who views the craft as a grueling, monotonous daily discipline. He compares the process to draw water from a well. You have to show up every single day, regardless of how you feel, to haul up the heavy buckets. The very tools a writer relies on are inherently flawed. Words constantly fall short of the emotions they are meant to describe, turning the act of creation into a profound test of psychological endurance. Which brings us to a rather blunt observation from Richard Ford. He points out that unlike performing brain surgery or piloting a commercial jet through a snowstorm, nobody actually has to write. If an author simply stops mid-sentence, there are absolutely zero immediate consequences. No one will care, and no one will even know. Add to that the crushing internal pressures, the persistent imposter syndrome, the terror of public exposure, and the stark reality that there is rarely any guaranteed commercial reward at the finish line. Curious, this creates a strange vacuum. If the process is voluntary, agonizingly difficult, and frequently unrewarding, millions of humans are still inexplicably compelled to wake up and subject themselves to it anyway. To understand the obsession, we have to look past the external misery and examine the deeply private, microscopic payoff. Writing functions as a specialized tool for authors to untangle their own consciousness. Before she became a best-selling novelist, Amy Tan worked as a corporate marketing writer, churning out text in exhausting 90-hour work weeks. She ultimately abandoned that lucrative career to write creative fiction for a very specific reason. She needed a way to find personal meaning in her own life. She treats the page as a private laboratory. It's a place of absolute safety, where she can take her own real-life conflicts, submerge them into fictional characters, and examine what she actually believes. For Alice Hoffman, the act of putting words down functions as a form of emotional regulation. Even when she found herself trapped by illness in a darkened room, writing allowed her to vividly experience beauty, love, and purpose. As long as she could reach her desk, she could regulate her reality. At this microscopic level, the audience is irrelevant. These authors write because it is the most effective way they have to process their lived experience and maintain their emotional sanity. But that internal therapy is only half the story. If we widen our lens, we see that the compulsion to weave words extends far beyond individual healing. It scales up to the survival of entire communities. This animated diagram illustrates a stark contrast in motivations. While Western literary traditions often focus on individual expression, represented by the radiating lines on the left, many Asian and African traditions view the author's role as a form of community stewardship. Here, as seen on the right, the focus is a continuous cyclical loop of ancestral wisdom. Authors in these traditions serve a vital function as a moral compass. They deploy larger-than-life archetypes, like heroes and tricksters, to instruct the next generation on cultural ethics and duty, protecting ancestral knowledge through the narrative. Storytelling becomes a tool to impose order on a chaotic, confusing world. It ensures that localized suffering is given broader communal meaning, turning random tragedy into a shared lesson for the group. This bridge between individual experience and cultural survival carries a heavy weight, especially for authors from historically marginalized backgrounds. Society frequently demands that a single writer serve as the representative voice for an entire, vastly diverse culture. Amy Tan explicitly rejects this sweeping generalization. No one person can speak for millions. Instead, she focuses fiercely inward, locking in on the uncompromising truths. of her own family history, like her grandmother's past or the specific cadence of her mother's English. By documenting these highly specific, localized realities, authors force outside observers to recognize a shared humanity. These granular details demystify the other, bridging the cultural divide more effectively than any broad generalization. When these specific family histories and rituals are recorded, they become a permanent physical record that cannot be ignored. By offloading the weight of displacement onto the page, marginalized writers transform what was once met with institutional silence into a permanent public archive, an unyielding typographic protest against cultural erasure. We now live in an era where text is cheap. Our screens are flooded with a deluge of digital noise and content generated instantaneously by artificial intelligence. This chart highlights the core difference in how that text is created. On top, data points enter a machine to spit out uniform blocks of text with zero friction. On the bottom, jagged, erratic human experiences like grief, vulnerability, and love are forced through the agonizing, deliberate process we explored earlier. A machine can perfectly mimic structure and grammar, but it lacks the lived trauma and the acute awareness of mortality that necessitate telling a story in the first place. Whether an author is spending weeks tweaking a single sentence just to hear its specific music, or painstakingly preserving displaced ancestral history, the friction isn't a byproduct of the work. The difficulty of the struggle is where the value lies. Writing is humanity's ultimate rebellion against existential drift. It is a profound, maddening, and vital mechanism for a person to look at the vast expanse of time and permanently declare, "I was here."